We look now at Hart, the candidate, and the man, the choices he had and the charges he made as he withdrew today, and we take a stab at how it affects the political landscape. Here to help us are George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee whose campaign was managed by Gary Hart, and Lewis, the former political director for the Democratic National Committee, now the National Director for Americans for Democratic Action, William Schneider, contributing editor for The Atlantic magazine, and Elizabeth Drew, Washington correspondent for The New Yorker. Starting with you, Ann Lewis, what was your reaction overall to the withdrawal speech today?
Well, I thought in watching that withdrawal that we were really seeing all of Gary Hart. It's symbolized in that one speech. That is, on the one hand, there was a rather eloquent statement, there was an enthusiastic response from the young people in that room, and at the same time there was this curious, detached air about it, almost, I thought, as if he were describing, for example, the blow-up of the Challenger, something in which he'd had no connection. There was this refusal to accept the fact that personal behavior can have public consequences.
George McGovern, did you see it that way?
Not quite. I've had a terrible feeling of sadness about this whole thing ever since last Sunday. I think there has been an overreaction. I understand that the press has a legitimate right to make some of the inquiries they have, but the whole thing is out of perspective. What Gary did has brought personal embarrassment to him and personal agony to him, but it's not the kind of issue that has damaged the country or threatened the security of the country.
How do you think he handled the withdrawal today?
Well, I think it was all right. It's very difficult under the pressure that he's faced over the last few days to appear rational at all. I don't know how he could be as composed and as thoughtful as he was, given the circumstances.
William Schneider, what your reaction?
Well, frankly, I was very distressed by the speech. He was annoyed. He was annoyed at us for blaming him for what he did. He tried to make a distinction between the personal side of politics and issues. He's done that all along. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't get the importance of issues of character, judgment, discretion, and how these affect people's judgment of a president. I thought there were a lot of things he didn't get. He was saying the system doesn't work, it's not my fault, and I thought that was a fundamental misreading of the situation.
Liz Drew, do you agree with what you've heard about the analysis so far?
Well, I think that he did what he had to do. I think we obviously saw an angry man, an embittered man. I would suspect that he's in for a rough time now. Actually, his political career is finished as far as we can possibly see. He's out of the Senate. He's now out of the presidency. But Charlene, he brought it on himself. Clearly, this was going to be an issue in his campaign. He was on notice that his sexual behavior, his extramarital behavior was an issue. And in the way he behaved, he showed an unfortunate tendency to take risks, even a sort of recklessness. And I think it was central to his candidacy, and the issue is not out of proportion.
Was there something, Ann Lewis, that he should have said today that he didn't say?
Well, first, I wish he had said, "I'm sorry." I think there are a lot of people in that room and across the nation who have identified with his campaign, who'd been rooting for him, who really believed in it. And I think a little personal word to them would have been in place. And second, again, and I'll pick up on what Bill Schneider said, in focusing so much on the system, I would not want people watching that to get the impression that there was somehow some hierarchical arrangement that was tramping down the rights of individuals. It is really much more fragmented than that.
Bill Schneider? Is that you, I hear, trying to say something?
It's Senator McGovern.
Oh, Senator McGovern, go ahead. I just heard.
I don't disagree with some of the things I've heard here from the other people on the panel tonight. What bothers me, though, is the perspective on this. Apparently, we've now figured out a way to observe and detect some of the irregularities in people's private sex lives. I wish we could find some way to determine in advance whether a president's going to violate his constitutional oath, whether he's going to sell arms to Iran at a time when it's illegal and divert the funds to the Contras in Nicaragua when it's illegal. I don't think Gary Hart would have been guilty of that kind of misjudgment. He obviously made a fundamental misjudgment in terms of this issue that we're talking about here the last few days.
But do you think he had any option today other than to do what he did?
No, I think Gary assessed the situation accurately. I think his campaign was over. He realized that. He was really out of the competition. I personally would like maybe a little bit more feeling of humiliation today and perhaps some feeling of compassion for the others that have been hurt by this. But basically, I think he handled himself pretty well in this withdrawal statement.
Do you think he had any options, William Schneider?
I don't think so. His campaign was over. He wasn't going to get anywhere. Unless he had evidence to substantiate his version of events, the thing was over. And I think he did what he had to do. What bothered me was it sounded like Jerry Brown. There was a certain mood of arrogance, of self-absorption in it that really bothered me.
Liz Drew, you started to talk about this a few moments ago. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the Washington press and elsewhere that this was just an accident waiting to happen, that Gary Hart self-destructed. I mean, you generally agree with that, right?
Well, I think there is some validity to the problem that was raised by this, and one could tell, talking to his old friends, talking to associates, they were very worried about his candidacy. That's what makes the behavior so much harder to explain. People who signed up for his campaign, I know, Charlene, specific instances, they went to him and say, look, Gary, let's not have any problems with the womanizing issue. Well, no, I swear I won't do it, so please give up your careers and your free time and work for me. So he betrayed them, he betrayed his following, and yes, I think you're right. There was kind of a sense of what happened, that Gary Hart is prone to taking risks. He likes to skirt at the edge of danger. We knew this about him before, and certainly we've seen it in full blown now.
George McGovern, you've known Gary Hart a very long time, and what do you think about these questions that are being raised, A, about his judgment, and B, about, as Liz Drew just said, character flaws that many believe are fundamental?
I think Gary put his finger on part of the problem when he says he finds it very awkward and difficult to talk about himself. That's a quality that I've noticed about him over the years. I would argue again that that in itself is not enough to destroy a campaign for the presidency. There have been so many tremendous problems before this country, and such breaking of faith with the public on the part of the presidents over the last 25 or 30 years, that it seems to me this one weakness on Gary's part, and it is a weakness, it's a flaw.
Now, you're talking about one weakness being what?
I'm talking about his inability to handle these personal problems, the sexual indiscretion or the appearance of that, the recklessness involved in bringing this young woman up from Florida to spend a weekend in Washington. This was not smart. All I'm arguing is that while those things are disturbing, no one of them damages the nation as a whole. No one of them is a threat to the security of this country.
But what about, excuse me, what about some of the...
Let me just finish this though. Gary, the transcendent issue that we've dealt with in the years I've been in politics and that Gary's been in politics has been the war in Vietnam. Nothing more important than that in the 60s and early 70s. He was right on that issue. And those people who couldn't see the bad judgment that took us into that conflict are going to have a lot more to explain on Judgment Day than Gary Hart is with these indiscretions involving a few women. I regret it. I don't think it's a good quality to have, but I don't think it threatens the Republic.
But
and yet here you have a man disqualified and out of the race for the presidency on that basis alone.
But many of the people who were interviewed in articles and were quoted today, like Pat Caddell, who worked with him very closely in his '84 campaign, were saying that it went beyond this issue, that it doesn't matter whether the details of this story are true or not, that it captured something that was real, and these were fundamental flaws in terms of dealing with people and dealing with his staff, the aloofness Ann Lewis referred to earlier. You just don't see it that way.
No, I would concede those things. I wouldn't draw the conclusion that Pat Caddell did, that this is such a fundamental character deficiency that it disqualifies him for the presidency of the United States. I'll concede these weaknesses that have been talked about on Gary's part. I thought he all but conceded it himself when he said he made serious errors of judgment. I would argue, though, that if that kind of standard had been applied to a good many of our great presidents, they never would have gotten to the White House. I'm thinking about President Eisenhower, President Roosevelt, President Jefferson, and others who couldn't have withstood some of the questions that have been asked of Gary Hart over the past week.
William Schneider, do you have any comments on this whole death wish business, or
Well,
any of
look,
the character flaw? Do you have any insight into that?
I really disagree with Senator McGovern on that point. Look, the reason we have these arduous, expensive, interminable, grueling campaigns is to find out what these candidates are about. We need to examine their personal qualities, their characteristics, temperament, judgment, discretion, because that's the way, it's the only way we find out how they're likely to behave as president. Of course he couldn't affect the national security. He doesn't have any power. But we get insights into his character, his behavior, recklessness, bad judgment, the possibility that many people thought he was lying. These are qualities that people don't want in a president.
And
we
Louis,
have to find out in advance, because once the president's in office, in our system, you can't get rid of him if he makes a bad mistake.
And Louis, what's your response to Kevin Sweeney, who just told Jim a few minutes ago that maybe the problem was that Gary Hart was just too unconventional? Is it that simple?
It's never that simple, and clearly nothing we've seen this week suggests that the answers are that simple. But first, I want to associate myself with much of what Senator McGovern has just said. It would really be a tragedy if, in this focusing now on the very personal, the very private aspects of our candidates' lives, we lose sight of the fact that we are really choosing a national leader, and that their public philosophy and their record as public people must be part of that. You know, the reality is that sensational news can drive out the non-sensational. I hope we will go back and put it in perspective. It is clear that Gary Hart's non-conventional political behavior up till this time, which was a great strength for him, which worked so well for him in 1984, also has meant in 1988, when his own campaign came under attack, he had relatively few allies to rely on. I think in that sense it did work against him. But again, it was also a great source of strength for him when he was running in the primaries 3 years ago.
All right, thank you. Jim?
We bring two local newspapermen into the discussion now. They are Daniel Lazar, editorial writer and columnist for the Bergen, New Jersey Record, and James Flansburgh, editorial page editor of the Des Moines, Iowa Register Tribune. He joins us in the studios of public station KDIN in Des Moines. Mr. Flansburgh, how does the press look from Des Moines, Iowa in this Gary Hart story tonight?
I think the press has done well on the handling of the Hart story. I think our politics has changed, and not enough people are really aware of it. Had Gary Hart been running for the nomination 30 or 40 years ago, the story might have had a different outcome. In those days, he had merely to impress, get the approval of 25 or 30 white males. Today, to win the nomination, you've got to impress, get the approval of hundreds of thousands of people. And
Who are those
so the
20
press handles it differently.
Who are you talking about, the 20 or 30 white males?
I'm thinking of David Lawrence, Richard Daley, Ed Crump, that kind of person.
I understand. But you don't think that the conduct of the Miami Herald or the conduct of the most recent, the Washington Post, and going to the Hart campaign with this story about a Washington woman, you think that was legitimate conduct by the press?
I think the Miami Herald's conduct was legitimate. They sort of botched the coverage of the story, but they got the main thrust of it, that Senator Hart has a propensity to get himself into ambiguous situations. I do quarrel with the Post saying, we've got a story here and it's really important, but we're not going to tell you about it.
Yeah. Mr. Lazar, how do you feel about the conduct of the press, both the Miami Herald specifically and now the Washington Post?
I think the Herald is really pretty bad, actually. I don't understand how Gary Hart's conduct in this respect constitutes a public issue, really, which merits the Herald's stationing reporters on a 24-hour watch outside his house with telephoto lenses trained on his home. The press declared it an issue, then acting on its own declaration, launched this investigation.
And that's improper?
Well, it's rather self-serving.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I can't quite fathom what the public relevance of all this was. He wasn't cavorting in public like Wilbur Mills. He wasn't a Jim Baker who'd made an issue of sexual immorality. He wasn't in the midst of a stormy breakup with his wife, which somehow spilled over into the press. by the Herald's own admission, he was out socializing, that's all we know, with a young woman. And for the life of me, I just can't understand what the political relevance of this is.
The political relevance, it seems to me, is that he put himself in an ambiguous situation. We judge the character of candidates today as well as their stand on issues, and it's entirely relevant. All the more so because he invited the coverage.
What does this reveal of his character, though? I haven't quite figured that out. He was out on having dinner with a woman. Some reporters trailed him home or were stationed outside his house. And when he was confronted 24 hours later, he stammered out an answer which really wasn't very terribly effective, but he didn't really, I don't know, we're unsure what of his character was revealed.
Yeah.
It raises questions, it seems to me, about his fidelity, his truthfulness, and his judgment. His judgment in putting himself in an ambiguous situation.
Elizabeth Drew, the question about the press. Senator Hart said today that this has degenerated the political process into the hunter and the hunted, the press being the hunter, the candidate being the hunted. Do you agree?
Well, I can understand that he feels that way, particularly today. And he has been hunted in an area that he didn't want to be hunted in. I don't see how you can equate why Gary Hart had to get out of the race with the decisions of other people not to run for one reason or another. I think he knew it was going to be an area that was pursued, Jim. He's been on notice about that by advisors, by all sorts of people. He took an unacceptable risk.
But you heard what the discussion between Mr. Lehrer and Mr. Flansburgh, and they're sitting from their perspectives in terms of the press's performance in this. And where do you come down?
I come down that it was inevitable that the press was going to follow this, was going to pursue the question. It was out there on the agenda about him. Jim, I think there's an air of unreality about discussions of the press, especially in this respect. We know it's thousands of people representing hundreds of organizations. Is anyone suggesting that they all get together and conspire to decide that something is not in the public interest, should not be told to the public? We get complaints that we were not told about John F. Kennedy. It was inevitable, and he knew that.
And Lewis, you've been you worked with the press on the other side. How does it look to you?
As I say, when I heard a discussion in which the press are the hunters and we, the campaign, are the hunted, we have felt that way before. But perhaps I shouldn't be telling you this, but it's not unfamiliar. I must say, on this one, I am troubled by the extent to which news organizations really became principal actors in this case, both in the Herald in raising the stakes as high as they did by giving it the kind of coverage they did, and then having to spend 2 days, by the way, defending the credibility of their own story. And then secondly, the Post, once again, raising the stakes, coming up with a story that really altered behavior. It seems to me there are a couple of instances in which some organizations stepped over the line from being observers to coming perilously close to being actors, and that's unfortunate.
Mr. Lehrer, is that what you didn't comment on the Washington Post action in this? Are you bothered by that as well?
Well, I guess I am somewhat, but probably less so than the Herald's action. Something about lurking in bushes really upsets me.
But what about the idea that the press has become principal players in this, much more so rather than just observers? They actually help play this thing out.
Well, that's very true. Although, I don't really quite blame the press. I blame the larger system, in which we elect an image and an entire man. We've got to inspect his family and his wife and his kids, rather than really paying attention to what his candidacy itself is about.
Yeah, but Bill Schneider, you think that's very legitimate, correct?
Oh, absolutely. The press is the watchdog of the public. It keeps an eye on what politicians are doing, on what Ronald Reagan is doing, and on what candidates are doing. They're the agent of the public in this respect, and that's their mission. They're a check and balance, probably the most powerful check and balance in our system, and guaranteed by the Constitution. That's their mission.
George McGovern, what kind of marks you give the press on this?
Maybe about a C plus, something like that. I don't entirely condemn the press. I'm somewhat sympathetic with members of the press who have to get a story and who, in a sense, are competing with each other for deadlines and who are severely criticized when they don't uncover deficiencies in politicians. What I would plead for, though, is some sense of balance and proportion in all this. I wonder how many people really feel safer about our presidential selection process now that we've driven one of the candidates out of the competition on the grounds of sexual indiscretions. I guess that's the reason he left, or judgments on an issue about how to handle his personal relationships. I don't feel all that much more secure that we've finally found a way to prevent people from reaching the White House that shouldn't be there.
Mr. Flansburgh, how do you feel about that? What the end result of this is?
I don't feel any more secure with this than I do with the old system, where the press had lots of marvelous secrets and didn't share them. This elitist idea that we've followed for so many years.
Yeah. Those days are gone forever now, right, Elizabeth Drew?
Absolutely, it's changing, and we will not go back to that for the reason Mr. Flansburgh said. It wouldn't be accepted. But what Ann said about not being comfortable with the press being an actor, I find that understandable, but again, that's the way it is. The press is an actor when it goes to a press conference and asks a question. The press is an actor when it writes an article about something. It will originate a story. Politicians use the press to the best ability that they can. They just love it when the press serves their purposes. It's when they don't that they get very upset.
I have high regard for Mr. Flansburgh, as he knows. I think he's a great member of the profession. But let me just say this about what has happened today. I still don't buy the notion that somehow it's an elitist system to give public figures a certain amount of privacy. I don't think that's elitism. For example, the home of the candidate, it seems to me, ought to be free from telephoto lenses. It ought to be free from stakeouts. We're not trying to pursue a common criminal here. Nobody said that Gary Hart was running a drug operation out of his house or an illegal numbers racket. We were trying, in this press stakeout, I'm talking about the press,
at his house outside of Denver,
to trap him in an embarrassing liaison.
Oh, you mean the other one here, I'm sorry.
That's correct, an embarrassing liaison with a woman. All I'm arguing about, that subject may be fair game to talk about. In the overall judgment of Gary Hart, I don't think it's enough to drive him out of the race for the presidency, and that's been the net result.
You feel he's been driven out of the race unfairly, Bill Schneider?
No, I don't think so. I think the purpose of this was to see how he behaves in a crisis. Every candidate running for president is going to have a crisis. With these two-year campaigns, it has to happen. Some of them stand up pretty well. Jesse Jackson did in 1984 when he had a crisis over the remarks he made, and so did Geraldine Ferraro over financial problems. Gary Hart didn't stand up too well under a crisis. He didn't have an explanation that people found plausible. And I'm afraid that he was found wanting.
But isn't it a fact, as long as we're talking about elitism, that the polls show a majority of people thought the press overplayed this?
All right, we have to leave it there, gentlemen and ladies. Thank you all six very much.